Do you want to day two every Eternal Open? Well, step one is always Netdeck. Hello everyone and welcome to FECast episode 83, How to Day 2 Every Open. This is going to be a cast that spawned from a comment a discussion really that happened in the Discord a few weeks ago, and we had hoped to get this out earlier, but real life got in the way. But here we are, and I think this is going to be one of our most important episodes ever. By we, I am, of course, talking about myself, Sunyveil, and also my good friend Stormblessed. How's it going?
It's going very well. I've been playing Eternal a bit more recently. Real life happens. But yeah, I've been playing Eternal a bit more, and I've been thinking about competition a bit more. So it's a good little time to do an FE cast.
Yeah. So this discussion began with a question from Snowbird in the Friends of Eternal Discord. And the question goes like this. It was asked on May 29th, which as of recording is about 3 weeks ago. Weird question for the group. I'd like to start making day twos more consistently. What should I be doing practicing to do so? Placing well is also nice, but for now I want to actually get in regularly. And I think this is an excellent question because a lot of the time we're talking about really high level stuff, like how to go from, making day twos regularly and being a well-established player to trying to qualify for Worlds. That's the topic of a lot of our discussions. But there are a lot of people in Snowbird's position where they're just trying to, start making a footprint on the competitive scene. And that's something I think we gloss over a lot. So today's episode is going to be all about how to start performing consistently, I suppose. Like go from not having a ton of experience to getting to a place where you're really comfortable playing in tournaments and starting to see some real results.
As a quick disclaimer, we just like to mention that, competition isn't everything and that winning isn't everything. So when we say always net deck, we're not saying, if you're net deck, you're not net decking, you're doing it wrong. The answer is if you care about winning, if you want to win these tournaments, then you haven't already have the backlog of experience of deck building or net decking or whatever, then yes, you might want to go for the net deck because you are far more likely to do well in a tournament setting than otherwise. If all you care about is building your own brew and having a good time on ladder and, winning less often, right, because you probably will, winning isn't everything, competition isn't everything, the tournaments aren't everything, right? So we're not making a distinction, a value judgment that if you're not trying to be super competitive, you're being bad. The answer is if your goal is this one thing, then we are giving you advice for this one thing. We're not giving you advice for the other scenarios.
Yeah, ultimately, if you're playing Eternal, you should be striving to have fun, whatever that entails for you. This is specifically just for the question that Snowbird asked. So this question spawned a really great discussion in the Friends of Eternal Discord. If you want to go back and look at it, it happened on May 29th, 2022, and it's in the main Eternal discussion channel. Some really good input from a lot of members of the community, and we're going to be quoting some of the things that people said today. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our content is focused towards some people that might be a little more established. And today we're going to be talking more toward people who are, trying to get established. And I think the first thing we need to do is make a distinction of these players. So we have 3 tiers of players we're going to be talking specifically about. The first one is going to be for people who are going for their first day 2. So maybe you haven't played in an open tournament at all before. Maybe you just play some ranked, but don't do it a whole ton. That's going to be our first tier of discussion. We're going to have a second tier for people who have day two'd a few tournaments but are trying to get more consistent. That's probably where Snowbird falls into with these categories. And finally, we'll have the third tier, which is beyond. If someone is a regular day 2 player, this advice will be for people to try to make the jump and try to qualify for Worlds or something. So did I miss anything, Stormblessed, or are we good to go on all the definitions?
No, I think those are some pretty reasonable definitions, right? So we're going from 0 to 1, 1 to regular, and then regular to deep finishes.
Yeah. And it's important to note that there's a ton of advice floating out there, but all of this is going to be within the context of a couple of limitations, really important limitations that you can't really, you know, you can't, you have to operate with these limitations in mind when it comes to preparation for these tournaments. The first, of course, is how much time you as a person have to prepare for a tournament. A lot of people work jobs or in college, and you can't just sit around playing Eternal all day every day. So the first limitation is how much time do you really have to prepare for the tournament, and anything that can shortcut that make it so that you can save some time is going to be valuable. And the second limitation is how close your time available to prepare for the tournament is to the tournament. So if you're preparing a month out, that preparation is not going to be nearly as valuable as preparation the day before the tournament. I say that even a week before the tournament, the preparation is not as valuable as preparation the day before. So a lot of the things we're going to say are going to be with these two things in mind. All right, let's go into our first tier. So this is for people going for their first day twos. If they've never day two tournament, maybe they've never played an open, this is their best shot at making day two.
Yeah. So the key advice here is if we're going from 0 to 1 is always net deck. If you are not net decking, you are doing it wrong. Maybe maybe change one card in the deck, but like realistically, just pick a deck from a good deck from the community, from Eternal Warcry, from whatever, some source that's reliable, and pick them. So our first quote from the community comes from Popo Tito, who says, "Most people I tried to help learn the game have told me that they have bad luck and they get screwed. When I see their deck, they have 6 cost cards along with a 25 power base deck. When people start playing the game, they shouldn't brew at all. They need to read cards and net deck till they learn the basics." And this is the key bit. This is basically the whole ball game here is that when you haven't done it yet, you got to stick with what's good. You got to stick with what's known. You can't reinvent the wheel in a sense because that just wastes time. As somebody said, you have less time because time is limited. So don't reinvent the wheels. Find someone else's wheel, and eventually you can make a better wheel. But you shouldn't start by being like, I'm gonna make the new best wheel. Start with the wheel that exists, and then eventually, once you've already made day two a couple times, then you can start trying to make the wheel better.
Absolutely. This will save you so much time for a new player because then you can focus on trying to get better or learning the deck or learning the metagame instead of trying to poke around and basically just having a lot of trial and error that might not be fruitful. So absolutely, if you are just starting out with competitive Eternal, always net deck. And it's important to get your net deck from the right place. Most of the time, you can just look on Eternal Warcry and there will be good decks there. But leading up to a tournament, that might not always be the case because a lot of people are keeping their best decks close to their chest. So Stormblessed's advice, look for usernames. Look for reputable people who you trust with their deck building skill. And I would like to say, I would like to believe that I do a pretty good job of this going up to tournaments. I do usually post what I think are good decks leading up to it. And I've also noticed Stormguard has, at least Stormguard wrote an article for the last Open, and I thought it was pretty good. It had a lot of good lists in there. And maybe I think the quality was a little spread because Stormguard went over a lot of different decks, but it's definitely a great starting point for picking a deck.
The other place to go to is with some caveats. T&E winning decks, by which I mean look for top 4 situations, are generally going to be pretty reliable. Sometimes they'll be a little bit sketchier than other times, but overall, if a deck has done well in the TNE, it's likely to be at the very least decent. Additionally, this is more for Throne tournaments and Expedition tournaments, but previous Throne Opens can sometimes also have reasonable decks, or at the very least places to pick 71 cards from, for instance. So, for instance, if you were interested in playing like a Hurukira variant, and you went to Sunyveil's last Hurukira build from 2 Throne Opens ago, you could remove the Jotun Hurlers and replace them with, another decent Kira card, and you'd probably end up with a decent Kira deck, right? The most recent Open, I had a Kira deck, and that's, Kira's been pretty much the same for so very long, with replacing like one nerf card at a time, right? So not every throne deck remains the same over time. Another example of a consistent throne deck would be Stonescar, right? It's been pretty similar across the years, just with a new card added, a nerf card removed. Very similar though from iteration to iteration. Clearly, this doesn't apply to any massive balance patches or brand new decks out of the wazoo, but there are decks from previous Throne events that are still going to be reliable in the next Throne metagame.
Yeah, just be wary of cards that have been nerfed. Like you mentioned, Jotun Hurler. That's a card that changed from when I posted that deck. And for the Stonescar example, I think Ronin X won the Throne Championship a couple years ago with a month or 2 month old deck list that Stormguard had posted on Warcry. So that's definitely a reasonable strategy, especially when it comes to Throne and the format doesn't move quite as much. So everyone, repeat after me. There is nothing wrong with net decking. Don't listen to the people on Reddit. Don't listen to the salt ads that tell you that you're stupid because you're net decking. There is absolutely nothing wrong with net decking. It saves you a lot of time and lets you focus on the things that you need to focus on.
So thankfully, I think in Eternal we have less people that whine about net decking than other communities. But the other interesting thing about net decking, as far as the negative mentality of thinking it's a bad thing, is that there's a the worst type of mentality to have would be that net decking is bad and I want to do well competitively, right? Because those two things don't really go together, especially if you don't have any day twos yet, right? If you're super deep on day twos, maybe you can get away with that mentality, but even then I'd find a suspect. But the mentality of I don't want to net deck and I want to do well in tournaments are in some ways mutually exclusive. If you haven't done it already, if you've ever made a day two and you have that mentality, you need to decide which one you care about more. You want to care more about building your own decks and having a good time, or being competitive, because you're not going to be able to do them both. You cannot have both of those thoughts at the same time.
Yeah, well, it's just going to be a much harder path. I think it is possible, but it's going to be a struggle. It's like playing Dark Souls. All right. Our next piece of advice is to pick a deck that you're comfortable with over what experts are saying are the right deck for the tournament. So here we have a quote from D-Dub talking about this. I think making day two is less about right deck for the meta and more about the right deck for you. Make sure you know your matchups, your mulligans, your outs, etc. Choosing the right deck is more important when trying to go deep day two. So we talk about net decking, and absolutely, take a look at these decks, but you don't have to just pick one and stick with it. You pick one, you try some out, and then find one that you enjoy or you feel comfortable with, and then really start trying to get comfortable with that. Your performance is going to be better with the deck that you're really comfortable with, much better than if you switch decks at the last minute without having a lot of experience with it.
Yeah, an example of a sort of a style of deck that some might have said was the best deck in the format, but might not have been the best deck for you, would be something like Overloader Combo, which is a deck that you really had to, stay alive and make sure that you stay alive, and then comboing off itself wasn't always, as easy as, play Machinations for 18 and, you should win, right? Sometimes you had to navigate through generating just enough power and digging through just enough cards, how to actually get there, right? Sometimes the deck, played itself, but a lot of games, you really had to know what the lines were. And so, if that wasn't the playstyle you enjoyed, or the thing that wasn't comfortable for you, then even if Overloader was deemed the best deck by, the pillars of the community, then it probably wasn't the deck you should pick, because there are very few situations where one deck is so dominant, tier 0, that no other decks can possibly compete, right? We've only had a couple of those in the entire history of Eternal. Rakana with Flip, Endra, right? Those are the two situations where if you weren't playing one of those two decks, you probably were doing it wrong. But other than that, there's been very few formats where one deck is so dominant that you couldn't pick a comfortable deck over a right deck, provided they were both decent decks, net decking decks. that the comfortable deck couldn't be the right choice for you for making a day 2.
Yeah. So in order to feel comfortable with the deck, I recommend playing with the same deck for at least 2 weeks, especially if you're just starting out. We have a quote from Notorious GHP on this. Play a lot because recognizing certain situations so that I don't have to think hard on them is very important, so I can think more on unique situations. If you're playing one deck, then you can just focus on the situations that come up with that deck and know how to respond and have experience in those situations. And then when they come up in the tournament, then you'll be better suited to deal with them. And then even so, like if you have unique situations, then you can spend a little more brain power thinking about those. And I mean, that, comes with, playing the same deck and facing the same other decks over and over again really helps develop that. And if when you're just starting out, you shouldn't even be thinking about things like matchup spread, which is something that a lot of people talked about in our thread. But that's talking about switching decks to get a different matchup spread, and you really want to just stick with one for a while if you're just trying to gain comfort with the same deck.
Yeah, and this can be difficult with how dial turns can be scheduled either by sometimes set releases a week in advance. Sometimes there's an important balance patch that happens that changes the metagame, takes out your deck or whatever. And also it can also be relevant as far as as somebody said originally, the proximity to tournament, right? Testing days before the tournament is better than 2 weeks out, right? So if you can't get the 2 weeks in, get as much time as you can in, because the closer you are to the tournament, the better testing is anyways, right? So if you can't get 2 weeks, but you can get 3 days, and you're suddenly decided this is the deck I want to do, you don't need to change the day before. You can be like, oh, I've decided 3 days in advance, I like this deck a lot, So just because we're beaten on ladder once by another deck doesn't mean you should just immediately want to jump ship.
Yeah, and I mean, along with that, it's not like the metagame of the tournament, like the tournament metagame isn't necessarily going to shift as quickly as ladder sometimes shifts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Stormblessed, have you ever been in a situation on day 2 where you were playing a deck and you didn't know what your cards did?
Yes, actually.
Is it a good feeling?
No, actually.
Yeah, so that's a really big reason why you want to just stick with the deck and have that comfort level, because that is the last place you want to be, is not know exactly how your cards are going to respond, because like you can't ask anyone. I don't know. I mean, maybe you can quickly ask a question to someone, but like most of the time you're not going to be able to pause the match and ask someone how something's going to work. You have to know what's going to how it's
you can't make a judge call in Eternal card game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then and that's the benefit to playing the deck enough time, is that you can then know what every card does, especially for complex cards. We have the 5 monofaction displays, and they all do different things. For example, Display of Will can make the enemy player sacrifice a relic or a site. If you don't play the card enough, you might not remember that they can make them sacrifice a site, because sites don't really come up in Expedition. I mean, yes, still Stronghold comes up a fair bit, but like maybe it just never came up for you. But because sites are just so uncommon in Expedition that you forget about the or site aspect of Display of Will, and then the moment when you really want to be able to use it, you've forgotten that the effect is there, and you don't know what the card does, and so, oops, I guess you don't win that game that you otherwise could have won.
Yeah, that's a very relevant example. Corner cases that you'll start to recognize corner cases the more you play with the deck.
Yeah. So the other thing about getting the first day 2, to move on from the subject of picking the comfortable deck and the net decking, is that sometimes just getting the day 2 can sometimes just be a confidence issue, right? The first time, Eternal, back then they were Eternal Championship qualifiers. The first ECQ I didn't enter because I wasn't confident in myself. I was like, "There's no way I'm going to do well." I don't know how to be competitive. And then the second one I entered only because I literally played the same deck for like a month and thought it was awesome. And I ended up getting a really deep run on the tournament. I was like, wait a minute, I've done well. I can do well. And so I just kept entering more opens afterwards, because I realized, oh, I do have what it takes. I am able to qualify in day 2s. And so like, I'm going to keep trying. And I also was like, oh, wait, it's actually really fun to participate even if I don't make it. So then, it was kind of just like both I enjoy this and oh, I can do this.
Yeah, this is kind of a strange one. Like, I mean, I don't really know how to express it, but like every once in a while you'll see someone posting about how they're going to play their first open and they're like kind of nervous about it, and you've played this person on ladder a bunch and you know they're a good player, and they just like crush their first open. I mean, crush is like relative. Like top 32 for a first open is definitely a really good result. But I mean, just put yourself out there a little. Don't be afraid to do so. Nothing bad's going to happen. Maybe you lose some gold from your account, but nothing bad's going to happen if you don't do as well as you'd hoped. And certainly don't tie your personal worth to results in a card game. That's just like it's a good way to feel miserable.
Yeah,
But
putting your self worth into a card game, or really dedicating your self worth into any one highly specific thing, is just setting yourself up for failure. Because if that thing ever gets touched, suddenly you're gonna fall down the misery hole, and you don't want to do that. So spreading out your identity is better than keeping it really niche and specific.
yeah,
But that goes beyond the scope of this.
yeah, it is. But the overall point is like, just give it a shot. If you're considering it all and you like playing Eternal, especially like, I don't know, on ladder, give it a shot. I mean, it's basically just playing 14 ladder games for each entry now. The barrier to entry is even lower than it used to be.
Yeah, you can just switch decks now. You don't have to pick the same deck twice, so you can even switch decks now. If you're like, man, this felt off, I'm going to switch to a different deck. But I mean, obviously that goes against some of our points, but still, do what's fun for you, right?
Yeah. So just give it a shot. You might be surprised with how well you do. All right, and finally, our last topic of advice for people in the first tier are to make sure that your gameplay is solid. Like, focus on your fundamentals. Here we have a quote from Alex Firo, who says, "My best advice is to work on your technical play first and foremost. Learning a deck is very helpful in the short lead period to a tournament, but having the fundamentals down will get you a long way with pretty much anything." And I think this is a really good one. So we've talked about how it's really important to learn a deck, and it definitely is for like your performance, but also just focus on fundamentals of playing well, because when you're being critical with your own play, that is something that's going to help you as long as you play Eternal or any card game really. So just focus on fundamentals. Try to make good plays. Think about the plays afterwards, and be like, was that a good play? Yeah, it was. I'll do that again next time. Or was that a good play? Nah, not really. Maybe I should do something next time.
Yeah, and the other idea is you don't really want to ever play around things. Just pretend they never have it. Just play, sort of almost solitaire. Play to the board rather than what could be in their hand, because that's going to work more often than not. Right? There is a certain subset of times where yes, you will make the wrong play because you didn't try to play around something, but you will but it is also equally likely, especially if you don't know what you're doing, that if you try to play around something, you will misplay to what you actually should do instead, right? So trying to play around things can sometimes be good, where you actually end up playing around the thing that would be punishing, or you could play around something that doesn't exist, or even if you're trying to play around, you play around it badly, and then you end up making a worse play than you would otherwise. So just play to the board, play what's in your hand, rather than trying to think about what your opponent has.
Absolutely. As I say, just make the level 0 play. I've said that a lot. Just play. Make the obvious play. Don't worry about what's in their hand. If the thought ever creeps up, well, what if my opponent has blank? Or what if my opponent draws blank? Just shove that thought out of your mind for now. Don't even worry about it.
I mean, I don't think it's purely an absolutist statement to some extent. Like right now, if you're playing, we'll get to eventually, but if you're playing like an FGS and Leash deck and you see your opponent's factions, you might be like, oh, I should try playing on a board clear. That's super common in the format. Or if your opponent has, 6 cards in hand, that would be a little different than how I'd play if they had 2 cards in hand, right? So there are some sort of big overarching strategies of things, but I wouldn't play on any specific card individually.
Well, maybe. I think for people in this bracket, though, it's good to just not play around anything, because sometimes they're not going to have it, right?
Sure. Sometimes, I mean, hey, that does work some of the time.
Yeah, that's how I won one of these tournaments.
Yeah.
They just never had it.
Do you want to tell that story again for the people at home?
Yeah, okay. So I was basically playing a deck I was playing a mono fire deck that had a bunch of units that had 1 health. So if my opponent played Blightmouth, or if they played Hailstorm, if they played um, Black Sky Harbinger, any of those cards, I was just totally dead. And you know what? I probably wasn't being any of those cards anyway. So I just played out my units, attacked every turn. If they had 4 power up and they were going to play an ambush unit to make a really good block, I just did it anyway. And sometimes they didn't do it. And, not enough people had answers for what I was doing, and I ended up winning the whole thing. And I mean, like, I was maybe a bit more reckless than I should have been. But I think that, if you just play like they don't have it, especially when you're just starting out, that's going to be your best shot. Don't get too fancy with it.
Because the answer is, if you're trying to play, so for example, in this case of, let's say your hand is full of 3/1s and you're trying to play around a hailstorm, and you're just like, I'm going to keep an extra 3/1 in hand. Say 3 turns later the opponent doesn't have a 3/1, or 4 turns later opponent doesn't have a 3/1, you missed out on 9 damage by not playing that 3/1 into play. And if the opponent played like a 3/3 unit instead, that 9 damage could be the difference between winning or losing. So playing out the units, because every turn the unit's in play, it accumulates advantage where maybe they don't have the board clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And our last piece of advice for this section is just play the same way you do in practice. Try not to play differently just because you're playing in a tournament than you have been playing on ladder. Just try to treat it like any other game. And I mean, yes, it is harder to win games in tournaments, but I think if you just stick to your guns, the wins will come. Stick to your guns, the wins will come. I should frame that quote or something. All right, let's go on to the next section. So this is for our second tier of players. So these are players that have maybe top 60 forward, day 2'd, whatever, a few tournaments, but want to day 2 more tournaments on a more consistent basis. So I think a lot of the things we said previously, can benefit these people. Well, now we're going to be focusing on this group. So the number one thing, and this is something that I spent, an entire podcast talking about with Collector, is to slow down when you're playing. It's really easy to make mistakes, and no matter how well you think you're playing Eternal, you can always play better. And the best way to do that is just give yourself a little more time to think about everything. And to do that, just slow down.
You've got 90 seconds on the clock every turn, and you are allowed to use them. You can use them. And don't worry if your opponent thinks you're slow playing. Like, 'cause I know that's a worry that I've had previously, that some other people have had, right? You don't want to be perceived as the BMer who's roping every turn, because no one wants to be rude, right? And so, like, everyone hates being roped on, but like especially in the tournament setting, slow down. It's not, especially in day 2 specifically. In day 2, no one's going to be roping, or you should never assume, if anyone's taking their time in the turn, that they are roping for BM purposes, because turns can be complicated. You've got the time to think. It's important to take the time you got.
Yeah, as I always say, if you are not roping every turn, you're playing too fast. And I'm not really joking. If you've seen me play in a tournament, a lot of the time I just rope every single turn. So, yeah, I'm not trying to play slow. Like, I'm not trying to be BM or whatever. I'm just, trying to think through everything.
Yeah, it can be easy to think your opponent's BM. It can be much harder to give them the I'm trying to think of respect. I forget where I'll go with that. Sorry.
All right, let's move on.
Okay, so this is kind of a repeat of the last section, but I just want to reiterate: play good decks. Seriously, like, don't just pick your favorite unconventional strat. Go for consistency. Pick what's good out there. Because once you start getting like 1 or 2 day ones, right? Once you make a day 2 of an open once or twice, you can start backslide and be like, oh, I've made it once or twice. I'm gonna go back to trying to do my own thing, and then you backslide back into never making day 2s again. I say this from experience, because there was a long stretch of time where after I made my first day 2, I stopped making day 2s again, and I think that's in large part because I kept picking my favorite unconventional strat. Like, I believe the last tournament that I really went for, going off the balls, meme style unconventionality was the I think it was either the Argenport or the Expedition Xenon Cultist metagame, one of those 2 metagames. And I brought Fire Time Primal 12 copies of the what's that weapon that plays Equivocate?
Spell Shaper, Sodi
Spell
Spell
Shaper, yeah.
Shaper.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this was back when Spell Shaper cost 2, and I had 12 ways of putting on like a Ramba or whatever, and it was a really neat deck. I mean, the deck was really cool, and it maybe in a different metagame or if there was slightly different cards, it could have gotten there. But I got 17 and 11 with that deck, and that's because I went for the unconventional strat. It was one win off of qualifying, and that's just because I picked the deck that I shouldn't have played. Even though I could have picked a better deck, I ended up backsliding from the original assumption of pick the best deck, and I ended up not going well with it.
Yeah, this is, advice that could be geared toward yourself and myself, right? Because
Yeah,
both of us like thinking unconventionally and doing something a little different. And a lot of times we can get a little too cute with things, and both of us have a lot of experience with times where we just played something that was bad because it was
yeah.
different, and didn't do as well because of it. That isn't to say that, thinking outside the box is frowned upon. But if you're just trying to get more consistent with the day twos, I think it's important to just stick with what has been, proven to be effective. It's I've done a lot of, I mean, I've gone a lot of day twos, and a lot of the time I'm just playing, what I think is the best deck, and everyone knows it's the best deck. I've
Yeah.
certainly done a ton of
I
that.
mean, and of course, the other thing is for all, I meme about specific cards that I love because I do fall in love with them. I don't actually play them as much as I like to hype them up, or whatever, because I just end up deciding that they're not the best deck. I mean, I have played Volatility in like 3 tournaments, whatever, with 3 or 4 maybe, and in only one of those was it ever a time where I was like, I'm picking it because I think it's actually the correct choice. Every other time I've played it, it's been I just want to have fun. I don't really care about making day two. Sometimes because I literally couldn't play on day two because I had real life things going on. And like as much as I talk about how much I loved Crafty Occultist. I was like, it's my crafty lad, my crafty child, my boy. I played Crafty Occultist in like one tournament ever, just because for whatever reason, it just never happened to be in a deck that I thought was the best deck, even though it was like my favorite card. It still is one of my favorite cards. It just ended up not panning out because I just went for the deck that was good, and I ended up qualifying because I picked the deck that I thought was good.
Yeah, you mentioned the best deck, and I think like once you've started to make some day twos, that's when you can start, trying
Sure,
out a
sure.
bunch of different decks, like maybe a week before the tournament. But you still want to feel comfortable. Like again, you just the nightmare situation is being in day two and not knowing how your card works. So like that should be avoided at all costs. Make sure you get a lot of reps in whichever deck you're playing, but maybe if you have a little more comfort with it, you can try a few different decks and pick one to work on for a week before the tournament.
The first time you're playing a deck, it's Overloader on day one of a tournament. That sounds like a miserable time.
I mean Watchwolf did win a tournament that way, but also Watchwolf has played in like 10 Pro Tours
Yeah,
in MTG, so yeah.
you're not Watchwolf, unless Watchwolf is
Yeah,
listening to this,
yeah.
in which case you are Watchwolf.
Yeah.
So then the level two, as so previously we had said that one of the goals with playing your deck enough times and being comfortable is that you get to know your own cards, right? Level one is making sure you know what your cards do, and so level two in this case would then be knowing what your opponent's cards do. If this can somewhat be a result of being comfortable with the deck, where if you play enough times with a deck, you can understand what your opponent's lines are, what they might be doing. So it's more likely in a sense that you will not know what your opponent does rather than what you do. And so, this just comes with playing the game, or in this case, it comes from maybe you do play the other decks in the format, right? Even though you're like, I'm going to pick, Argent Port Control, classic Argent Port mid range style deck, but you play some of the other decks in the format so you can understand what their game plan is, what they're going to do. So that way, when you end up switching back to your original deck that you decide you want to actually play, you have a better understanding of what the opponent's cards are going to do.
Yeah, it's always helpful to see another perspective on this. I mean, even if you're set on your deck for the tournament, it's very valuable to play other decks just to see how the other matchup feels. I think that like the people who don't do this come up with like wild misconceptions of like aggro's so easy or control's so easy or stuff like that. Like, oh, this matchup is completely mindless. I've heard plenty of those types of arguments over the years. And it's just not the case. You can tell that the people who are saying this don't have a ton of experience playing from both sides.
Yeah, this expedition format, not to date this too heavily, but this expedition format is definitely one that can lead to that sort of mentality. And then the corollary to this point about what the opponent's cards do is thinking about day two aspect, right? Day one versus day two. In day one, you can only know what your opponent's going to do by making assumptions about the deck that they're playing and having either played with a similar version yourself or on ladder. Whereas day two, you have open deck lists, so suddenly you can potentially see what your opponent can do, and that can also result in a different type of misplay, which is where you focus too heavily on what the opponent has in deck and forget about what's on the board, which goes back to Sunny's play level 0-1 plays, right? Where it can definitely be really helpful. Like, it definitely is exceptionally helpful to look at, the opponent's deck list in a day two format, but you don't want to overdo it and, like, go too far in the direction of thinking too much about their deck list.
Hey Stormblessed, have you ever been tilted in in a tournament and it has negatively impacted your play?
Absolutely, Sunny. Have you ever done this?
Oh gosh, don't remind me. This happens to everyone. It's really unavoidable, but you definitely want to minimize the impact if at all possible.
Yeah, so the things I like to think about, and this is again very rudimentary, right? Very reductionist in some aspects. The first one less than the second, but each game is an island and each move is an island, right? You shouldn't let the previous games impact the future games, and likewise, you should try to let the previous turns not impact the future turns. So if you happen to either screw up or get unlucky in game one, you know don't let that impact game two. They're completely different games. Which is that one I've sort of at this point I've gotten pretty decent at not letting previous games impact future games. The much harder one, and I think this goes for most people, is that previous moves impacting future moves, right? I make a misplay, and I am far more likely to make a misplay on turn. If I make a misplay turn three, I'm more likely to make a misplay turn four, even though they're independent events to some aspect, right? The board states are going to be dependent on each other, but making the correct move on turn four, it doesn't matter if you misplay on turn three. There's still going to be a correct move to make on turn four, regardless of whatever you made on turn three. And it could be very easy to mess up on turn three and then keep messing up over and over again. In the last open, I screwed up. I miscounted my power and I didn't get my Hojin triggers. And for the next like 5 turns, I misplayed like every single turn. My opponent was at 1 life every single turn because I just kept accumulating my mistakes and I kept accumulating the tilt over time. I didn't think that each move was an island. I didn't think to separate all the events together. I pushed them all together to the point that it just overloaded my brain. I kept tilting off.
Yeah, any spot you are in an internal match, whether it's the beginning of a new game or the middle of a game, it doesn't matter how you got to that spot. All that matters is what you can do from that spot to continue on. And I think that's really important and also very difficult to do because, I've certainly been in the same situation where I'm compounding my mistakes because I'm thinking about them.
And it's not just as far as mistakes you make. It can also be your opponent got lucky on turn three, and so you start tilting on turn six or whatever, right? Where it's like, no, well, it doesn't matter if the opponent got a good top deck on turn three or turn whatever, you insert whatever turn it is. It doesn't matter what happened on the earlier turn, even if it's the opponent doing something good. This later turn exists independently of that other turn.
Yeah. So we have a few good quotes from the community members here regarding tilt. Notorious GHP has one that's pretty helpful. If you're mathematically inclined, it can really help with being less tilted by variance by looking at percentages. And this is something to do after the match, like to feel better about the tournament.
Sorry, I'm laughing because like during the match, I'm starting to tilt off. Time to put the hyper geometric calculator.
Yeah, I am someone who is very comforted by statistics. Not everyone is like this, but if I look back and if I lose and my opponent got really lucky, or it feels like they got lucky, and then I calculate and it's like, well, they were like 10% to draw this card for like 6 turns, and then cumulatively that adds up to being like not that lucky. Like that's a totally reasonable thing to happen.
Yeah, so this actually works in some aspects in both directions, right? You can either see, oh, this happens more often than my inclination was, right? Maybe it's like a 20% event. It's like, oh, it was a 20% event. I guess that's not that bad. Or if it turns out it was like, oh, this was a 0.5% event, then it's like, oh, I guess that's also not bad. I mean, that happened. I guess I was unlucky. That sucks. I guess it's easier to move on. It's easier to get closure in either scenario. The only trick here is that you can definitely lie to yourself by manipulating the numbers you in. So, for example, hypergeometric calculator is the classic way to look at the probability statistics for card games. And if you look at that, you can very easily lie to yourself by inputting numbers that benefit being luckier or unluckier as you want. And so you want to make sure you're being honest with yourself about the numbers you're inputting into the math. Because if you input the bad numbers, you're gonna get a bad result.
Yeah, it can be like if you don't have a lot of experience with statistics, it can be difficult to like understand exactly what you should be calculating.
I'm not necessarily even saying understanding. I'm saying you are either unconsciously or consciously choosing the number that makes that the position you want to make that helps you tilt more because it helps you better, right? Making it so you're unluckier, for instance, by just saying like, oh, I had more draws than I otherwise actually had, right? Or it's like I drew more power than I actually drew, even though secretly you're like manipulating the numbers around by like 1 or 2. You're like, oh, this counts as an extra draw, even when it like maybe it doesn't count as an extra draw.
Yeah, that's true. We have another quote from world champion the Overmaster on Tilt. The Overmaster says, "Don't beat yourself for making errors. Everyone makes crap plays sometimes, and if you think top level players don't make bad plays, you are wrong." And that's absolutely right. I mean, Stormblessed and I know that from personal experience.
Yeah, top level players, the key to be, what do they say, right? In chess, in Eternal, right? The key to winning a game is not to make no mistakes; it's to make the fewest mistakes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even if you've been playing bad all game, you've got a chance to turn around if your opponent's also been playing poorly all game. So, yeah. Every move is an island. Each move is an island, I guess it's written here. All right, let's move on. This is a really big, important one, and we have a quote from Jez on this. So Jez says, "A big thing that people miss, I think, you need to recognize your mistakes in the games that you win." And I really like this. This is something that I've been preaching for a long time. Even if you win games, it's really helpful to try to go back and recognize where you could have played better. Like, sure, the outcome couldn't have been helped. Like, you won, that's the best possible outcome in a game. It's either win or lose, right? But if you go back, not just for the games that you lose, but games you also win, and are critical of your playing and see if there are things that you could have done better, that's really going to help you down the road. And it'll, looking at not being satisfied with just getting the W and actually looking at things to improve on, that'll really take your play to the next level. I talk about this a lot on my podcast of, I forget which number episode it is, but everyone in this game is trash or something like that. Whatever. It'll be linked in the description. Many of you have probably heard me reference this episode before.
Yeah. So a corollary to this is, very similar corollary is that, just because you lose, it doesn't also mean that you made a mistake. Sometimes you can, I mean, there's the classic Star Trek YouTube video or whatever, if you want to find the thing from TNG where, it is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is just life. You can make all the correct plays and you can still lose, right? We have a probability-based card game. You can take the line that's going to win you 60% of the time, and if you make that line, that will be the correct line. But you will lose 40% of the time that you make that line, and you just have to accept that, sometimes you can win games or lose games, and it's not the fault of you. It's not the fault of your opponent. That just is just going to happen. So it's important to recognize when you made a mistake, not just that, that you made a mistake, right? You can't just think, I lost, I made a mistake. It has to be, I lost, did I actually make a mistake? Because you can sometimes go too far into trying to recognize mistakes that you start thinking things are mistakes when they're not mistakes.
Yeah, and I mean, this is dangerous territory because you have to.
Sure.
There was a quote from someone who posted in the Friends of Eternal Discord once that said, like, of the games that I lost, 90% of them there was nothing I could do about it. And I just did not believe that. That sounded not right to me. But, you have to accept the possibility that there's nothing. It's possible that there was nothing that you could have done. But also you have to, look for things and be like, could I have done this better? Even if it wouldn't have impacted that actual outcome of the game, maybe it was a way, I mean, maybe a small change here or there could have a bigger impact down the line, for one thing. But also, maybe it can bring you closer to victory in games that things break your way a little better.
Yeah, it goes down to a lot of things, and one of them is, the people that are saying 90% of the time I play perfectly and I lose anyways. The shuffler's out to get me. They're also less likely to accept criticism, right? If they're picking these super hyperbolic statements of I play perfectly and I lose 90% of the time anyways, they're not likely to respond well to. maybe you're not playing correctly, or maybe your deck's not good. That's the other alternative. Maybe they are playing correctly, but they just have a really bad deck. A six drops with 25 power deck.
Yeah. All right. Here's another good tip from D-Dub as far as self-improvement goes. D-Dub says, one way of practicing with intent besides recording games is taking notes during or after each game. Like just jot down 1 or 2 sentences on your mulligan, market decisions, or pivotal turn, etc. Just the act of reflecting on some of these key moments can help you identify areas you are navigating well or may need to improve. I think this is absolutely critical. As much as we say, like, after the game, just wash it off, the next game is an island, you still want to have this moment of reflecting. And I think, like, usually the queue times in Eternal are long enough that you can do this while queuing for the next game, or at least I can. Maybe I shouldn't be advising this to people who aren't used to doing it. But, taking even 30 seconds looking at the game over screen or whatever to reflect on a game regardless of outcome and just like write something down or type something out or even just make a mental note of something that could have been done differently and then like quickly evaluating if you think that would have changed it in a positive or negative way. That's really helpful, and this is something that I recommend to everyone and is something that I definitely do for myself all the time.
Yeah, this is something that I used to do a lot more. Especially during tournaments. I did this heavily day one of tournaments. I would heavily like sometimes I would not even queue up, but I just write down thoughts. Like I remember one time, one note I made to myself was like, in this game, my opponent played 3 Heart of the Volts warped in a row, and each of them got an equivocate. And I was like, I lost that game, but writing that down made me feel better. It made me, accept like, yeah, I got this kind of unlucky situation in my life, and I accepted it because it wasn't just like, it wasn't just this nebulous thing. It was this concrete thing I've put into the world now of 3 Heart of the Bolts off the top into 3 equivocates, exceptionally unlikely. I think it was like 2 equivocates and a torch or something actually. 3 0 cost pieces of interaction. And that just helped me even just dealing with tilt, writing down an aspect of the game helped me deal with tilt. But yeah, I stopped doing that as much because I started joining voice calls during the tournament, so I'd have someone to talk to about what happened in the game rather than writing it down. But similar idea, similar intention as far as having a reflective moment on each game and actualizing in the real world, not just keeping in your head. Actualizing in the real world is very important. It's very easy to keep things in your head and have them simmer, but actualizing the real world either by verbalizing it or writing it down can be much better than just leaving your head. And that goes for
Yeah.
anything too, beyond the scope of this conversation.
I'm not sure that this is the type of thing that I would want to do in the middle of a tournament because then you might be distracted when you start your next game.
In the middle of day 2, no, but I did day 1s. I never did day 2.
Yeah. I feel like this is just more of a like when you're playing on ladder and you're just like, trying
Well,
to
I found
improve in a
I found it
general.
helpful day 1, so maybe try it out. Maybe it doesn't work for
Yeah.
you. Not gonna work for Sunny, but it worked for me. So
Yeah.
different people
Fair
do
enough.
their. And then, I guess this is a another thing, right? Not every piece of advice is going to impact everybody the same way, right? While all these advices are generally going to be valuable, some piece of advice will be more valuable than others.
Yeah. All right, moving on. So now we're on our third tier of player. These are people that are established and looking to get those last few percentage points to go from, a regular day 2 player to collector, basically. So this is like really getting the last bit out of your eternal personal growth or whatever, going from being a good player to being a great player. So let's start off with a quote from Doc28. Generally speaking, I think that the best place to start is a hybrid of intentional practice, experimentation in playing the best deck. Once the solid finishes start to rack up and you develop a sense of confidence in your card meta evaluation skills, I think there's a lot to be gained from brewing and playing your own decks. And so up until this point, we've been talking about just net decking, pretty much just sticking to one deck and really, getting solid with that. Once you feel really comfortable about your ability to make day 2, that's when maybe you should try experimenting and, working on deck building or deck tuning in order to come up with a new angle in order to try to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, it's. I mean, this one's really hard because this is sort of, again, level 3 thinking is really quite difficult. Um, and not every. I mean, this is especially where things aren't always applicable to everyone. Um, For example, Collector doesn't build decks quite as much, but Collector does play decks really well. So Collector can give a lot of good feedback on what's working in a deck and what's not, more so than building the deck themselves. So this is sort of where you kind of have to start tailoring your approach to who you are as a person, rather than looking at some more generalist ideas.
Yeah, well, Collector works closely. I mean, you would know better than I, but I assume Collector works closely with some people who do build a lot of
Oh,
decks.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, like, that's part of being on a team where they're, loosely defined roles and people understand what their teammates are good at and delegate
Yeah. So this
responsibility,
this
basically.
this is this is where we get into the next point, which is, and this applies, I think, heavily, is join a community, right? Not just like a team aspect, but like you got to join a community, which is people who are interested in doing the same things, and actually taking advantage of it by conversing with them, having Discord calls, or just conversations on Discord, right? Putting ideas out there and getting feedback, or asking for someone to put an idea out there so you can give feedback on them. The classic one for FECast is, of course, the FE Discord, which is a good place to be if you want to talk about Eternal. And, for example, recently Sunyveil initiated a Discord call a few nights ago and was streaming Expedition. But, and this isn't taking advantage of, but like other people in FE can also do the exact same process. They can all say at any moment, like, hey, I'm going to start streaming Expedition. Does anyone want to join? And, you'd probably be surprised that there are probably other people that would want to talk about Eternal or watch you play Eternal in a Discord call. So you should, more people should try taking advantage of that, and not just Sunny doing it, but like anyone else can do it too.
Yeah, and if you happen to hear this before the Expedition Open coming up next week, I will actually be doing that each day this week. Seeing as I'm not working 6 days a week anymore, I'm trying to make a little more time for tournament preparation. So I'll be initiating a voice call where we can bounce these ideas off of each other. A lot of good input happened on last night's, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the weeks. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We haven't really talked about using other people in this, but it's really an important part of getting better. Like just having another set of eyes, someone else with another set of experiences looking at the same problem that you're looking at is really helpful. I've talked a lot about how card games are extrapolating a sample size that's too small to be extrapolated and trying to make sense of that. Well, if you have someone else who has a lot of experience, that will really help increase the sample size and get you a better idea of things. I'd also say that, I mean, I don't think the main Eternal Discord is a good place to, I see some weird conversations that I really don't agree with in there. Occasionally something good will come out of it, but I do not recommend it. There are other places. Friends of Eternal Discord, obviously, Misplay Discord are open to everyone. And then there are a bunch of teams that are invite only that I'm sure lead to excellent, settings for this type of thing.
I put excellent asterisks. I'll give a big old asterisk after excellent there. But no, so the other aspect, I wanted to give an idea for is, the using other people thing. Perspective I want to give this is, as far as taking advantage of the community, is that this is definitely a sort of tier 2, tier 3 idea, right? You first want to, build up yourself to a point of, I can pick a good deck off Eternal Warcry and recognize that it's good, and I can pilot it competently, not at the best, lights out aces collector levels, but competently enough, right? You want to make sure that you have a semblance of yourself, and then you can reach out to have confidence in talking to other people and knowing what to say, in a sense. Right, so sort of a tier 2, tier 3 idea as far as going for others, to improve in a significant margin. The other idea here is, I do this all the time because I also just enjoy this. Is I spectate people in client, and I think about what they're doing. And this is different than watching a stream, because when you're watching a stream, you're doing it kind of for entertainment, community purposes. You're listening to the stream, or you're watching their body language. They have a face cam. You're reading chat. You're talking in chat. It's a very different ball game than spectating in client and thinking about what plays your person you're playing is making, what plays the opponent's making. Would you make a different play? You can sort of simulate this when streaming as well by muting the stream and trying to ignore chat. but it's definitely a different ball game compared to doing it in client in a lot of ways.
As someone who's streamed a lot of hours, I can tell you that my play is not very good on stream compared
That's
to what
also
I'm
true.
capable of. Yeah, so like I think part of what you're going along with what you're saying is that you really need to be watching someone when they are playing their best, right? And you need to be focused on that where someone's not trying to be entertaining. So spectating in client is one way to do this. Also, I think that the Discord calls are a really good place for this. It's something that you can't really get from Twitch, even though from the outside it might seem like the two activities are similar. They're really not in what the focus is.
Mm-hmm.
One last thing, I guess this is our last piece of advice, unless I missed anything else, is record your own gameplay. This is something that I've been preaching for a long time, and I think it's really important. It takes a lot of energy to be critical of yourself, and it takes a lot of energy to record your own games and to go over them, maybe even have someone else go over them. It takes a lot of energy to do it, but it is worth it. It'll make you so much better. You will see things that you don't, being able to stop and really think about situations where you didn't have enough time or you didn't think to consider other possibilities during the moment. That's a great tool for learning and growing. So we used to do the piloting club in Friends of Eternal, but we haven't done that for a long time. But the process is still a very good one of recording your own gameplay and reviewing it either by yourself or with other people.
And if you can't do that, you can just make top 4 of an open, and then Daryl will record your game for you.
Okay, yeah, I guess so. And you get expert commentary on what's going on. Yeah, that seems.
That was a joke for the record.
Yeah, it was. I should have recognized that as a joke earlier. All right, well, that concludes our segment of how to reach your first day 2 or day 2 more consistently, or go from consistent day 2ing to be a great Eternal player. If you have any more ideas for this, let us know, because this was a really interesting topic, and I think the discussion around it was really good. I was certainly very engaged with it. Yeah, and I'd love to see it continue as we go forward.
Yeah, so to temporize this cast more so than making it a generally applicable one, let's quickly round up the state of Expedition and what we view as sort of the 4 pillars of the format moving into the Expedition Open in a little over 10 days from now, 14 days from now, close to 14.
It's a week from yesterday, isn't it?
Yeah. Is it a week? Okay, then 7 days. Sure, in a week.
Yeah, that's really coming up.
So there's four main pillars, and I'm just going to briefly stay with there, and then we'll go over them in a little bit more detail. So we have sort of Argenport mid-range / control decks. We have Winchest Unleashed decks. We have heavy primal decks featuring lots of Aegis units, and we have fire aggro decks. So let's start by talking about Argenport mid-range / control decks. So what's the key highlights of their decks?
Yeah, so Argenport has a lot of really good multi-faction cards. There's Black Book, the 1/7 that takes a card from the opponent's hand. There's Slay, there's Nothing Remains. Those are all multi-faction Argenport cards that are extremely powerful. I think they're like the best at what they do for the cost. There's also Gift of the Archbank, which works pretty well when you're playing like an attrition game plan. That's the relic that gives all your Minotaurs and relic weapons +2/+1 and makes 2 1/1s with Taunt. Yeah, I think Argenport is an exceptionally solid deck. If the tournament was tomorrow, I would definitely be playing Argenport.
I think Gift is a little bit more suspect than the others, just because Barbarian is literally everywhere. Barbarian Guerrillas is really quite solid and kills all the attachments in the world.
Yeah, I guess so. I actually think it's the best card in the format, Gift of the Archbank.
Really?
It does die to barbarians, but if someone's not playing fire, there aren't really that many great options against it. I mean, you've got like Display, but then you still end up with the 2 1/1s and a 1/4, and maybe you got to get some value out of the buff that gives. So yeah, I mean,
it's a solid. The Argenport mid range has been a solid metagame staple for years in the past. The metagame staple for years to come.
Yeah.
Speaking of things that aren't metagame staples in like every metagame, we have Winchest Unleashed. So this is playing Miner's Musket. the 2-fire relic weapon that gives the top unit or relic of your deck -2 cost. And the goal here is that you play Myron's Musket, you make a 3-cost Unleash unit cost 1, and then you play 6 of them in one turn, and then you just kind of do something super degenerate. It's a little bit high rolly, not it doesn't you don't need to high roll to win, but like it has this insane high roll. And it's just it's a solid deck. I'm leaning towards it at the moment, but there's lots of solid decks out there, so I just think that it just does a really powerful thing, even if it can be answered. It's really funny. So the card Nothing Remains just be like, oh, Nothing Remains stops the Unleash combo by making them all voidbound. They can't be returned. Except Unleash counters Nothing Remains by putting a copy into the void already, so you can't just give the unit voidbound in play because you already have one in the void.
Yeah, I don't know how much I like this deck. It does have staying power for sure once you get it going. But like, if you don't draw Miner's Musket, you're playing a lot of really mediocre cards, and even when you do, you're like not doing anything too powerful, and then you have one turn where you do something really powerful, and then the rest of the game, a lot of the time, you're not doing anything too powerful after that either. So I'm not a huge fan of this deck, but I haven't really tried it out that much.
I think
Yeah.
I think the deck is really solid and is better than it might look on paper as far as consistency goes. Additionally, I think it's also, I mean, this is just mostly a preferential thing rather than maybe a balance thing. I think it warps the format in an unfun way and is also just like really boring to watch and play. Like I've had multiple games on either side of the equation, both playing the deck and against the deck, where they're playing 7 Parliament Elders, or I'm playing 7 Parliament Elders, and we know the other side has a board clear of some variety, a Saloon Massacre, Nothing Remains, Elemental Fury, or Display of Survival, or Fall of the Spyrite. You know that the opponent has some sort of board answer, but you gotta play your 7 Parliament Elders anyways because maybe there's the 2% chance they don't have it. What do you do? Not play all 7 of them? Like it's just so boring to play 7 in a row knowing they're going to get removed. It's just slow, and I just don't think Unleash is fun when you're reducing it with Musket.
Yeah, I agree.
For the
Certainly
format.
the gameplay is not very interesting because you're like, did I draw a musket? Did I draw
Yeah.
the unit that I musketed? Musketed.
So I think
Yeah.
that I think that these Unleash decks market. I think that Expedition would be a healthier format if Musket wasn't in the format.
Yeah, I agree. All right, on to our next pillar, Primal, which includes like Huru or Spellcrag or Monoprimal or even Fountain Splashing. There's
There's
a
lots of
lot of
things.
powerful stuff here, but
Basically,
like,
the key is that you're playing Plunk and you're playing a 4-cost Island and you're using the power of huge Aegis flyers to kill the opponent.
yeah, that you have very good Aegis threats. That's what this one's all about. You also have the 4/3 flyer that can gain an Aegis if you contract it. I think usually
Depending on
you don't contract that card, but it's still like, it has the potential to be an Aegis card. There's also Chirigap, which doesn't have Aegis, but kind of has pseudo Aegis.
there's a lot there's a surprising amount of variation once you go past sort of the staples of Plunk, Island, Serpent Hive, right? There can be a surprising amount of variation, but they sort of all do a generally similar game plan. Some do it better than others. For example, one that is potentially a highlight right now is Spellcrag, that Spifferific, who just won a TNE today as of this recording, with Spellcrag, like a fire version of this heavy primal deck. It looks pretty solid, plays out pretty well. So they'll do a little bit different things, but they all kind of do a similar style of what direction they're fighting for.
Yeah, big Aegis threats.
and finally, we have fire aggro decks. Affectionately called Praxis Crack the Earth because they look like a Crack the Earth market. They have like anywhere between like 12 and 16 5-drops, all with charge.
Yeah, like Riva and Inferno Phoenix. Is it Inferno Phoenix? That's the name of the 5 cost one, right?
So there's Riva, Inferno Phoenix, Solux, and Evelina, all solid 5-drop units with charge, and some number of those make a Praxis deck, and you just are like, well, I guess I'm playing 5-drops deck, and it works out sometimes, oddly enough.
Yeah, the thing about Ira decks is that they don't have to be good. They just have to be good enough. And I think that the format is pretty slow and there's a lot of awkwardness. Like there aren't a ton of powerful turn 2 plays. That kind of just playing Argent Port soldier into 5-drop flying in charge, into powerful 5-drop, can kind of be good enough. So there's probably some sort of fire aggro deck that is good enough, but like I don't know. I don't know what to go with it. I need to mess around with those. The new promo is pretty good. The 3-cost 3/2 that plays weapon when you play it.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the other promo, Exodus, which is found in the practice charge decks.
Yeah, that card's pretty good too. Anyway, so those are like what it's looking like right now. Of course, we could see this change drastically in the coming week. But right now, if I was playing a tournament tomorrow, I would just play Ardenport, and Stormblessed sounds like you'd play Unleash.
Probably.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to play Unleash, but I'd probably play Unleash.
Yeah, I don't want to play Ardenport either. Yeah, I'm looking forward to what happens after this tournament. Anyway.
I believe we're about to start ending the cast and running it down, saying goodbye to all the lovely folks. I would just like to point out that previously I have stated that Feln Adept is going to be the best card in the set if Unleash doesn't warp the metagame, and I will say Unleash has warped the metagame. But Direwolf has buffed Feln Adept, so I don't know what that says. I don't know if that makes me right or wrong, but I feel like somehow it sticks it to Sunyveil.
Yeah, first they planted Stormblast, and now this. I just can't believe it.
Because the irony, of course, is that Sunny could take the position of they buffed it, therefore you were clearly wrong about Feln Adept, but they buffed Feln Adept, and that just is great. So
Yeah, I actually don't think that even if it weren't for Unleash, I don't think Felon Adept would actually be that good, at least not in Expedition. Just because you kind of have to jump through too many hoops in order to get to work.
You gotta jump through hoops, Sonny. Got him.
What?
You gotta jump through all the hoops, Sonny.
Okay, whatever. All right. Huge thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion in Discord that led to this podcast. So Snowbird with the initial question, and then contributions from Popo Tito, D-Dub, Alex Firo, Doc28, Notorious GHP, and Jez. I think that's everyone we quoted in today's, but there was a lot of other good stuff if you want to take a look at the entire discussion.
There was good back and forth, and there were definitely valuable comments and people commenting on comments that we didn't mention here, right? We only have so much time, and we have other things we want to say ourselves, not just repeating other people's words. But don't take this as the full sum of valuable conversation that was had. Yeah.
So thank you to everyone everyone in the community. If you're not a part of the Friends of Eternal Discord, I strongly recommend it. FE is recruiting for the team. I mean, FE's always been open for everyone who wants to join, but especially since I don't have a job, I'm planning on being more active this year as far as participating in competitive Eternal. I wasn't very active last year. So yeah, join the Friends of Eternal Discord. Link is in the description or show notes or whatever. Somewhere, wherever this video is, it's going to be there below it. There'll be a link there. All right, thanks everyone listening. Thanks to the patrons who still support us. It's been a while, and I couldn't even access Patreon to thank people individually because I couldn't see it. But thank you to anyone who somehow supports the show, even though it's been extremely sporadic of late. Stormblessed, anything before we sign off?
Oh, I already did my poking of you, so I'm good.
Okay, yeah. All right, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, we will see you in the friend zone.